Hey you guys, it's Peter, and welcome to my channel, Peter Likes Books. And I'm sitting here with my coffee. Let me have a little sip. And I'm ready to go. Are you guys ready? I think I'm gonna try to finish this. I think I only have like 30 pages or something like that left. So I'm gonna try to finish it in one setting. Are you guys ready? I'm so sad, it's the end. I can't believe it, it's the end already. All right, let's get into this. Chapter 35. As I drove home, the storm got worse. Hail began to hit the top of my car, and it was so loud I thought it might rip open the canvas. I thought about my session with Neil and my talk with Alex. I didn't feel much better, but I didn't feel any worse either. Actually, that wasn't true. I did feel a little bit better. At least now I had some hope for the future. At each stoplight, the car behind me stopped within inches of my bumper. I was a little worried that it would slide and hit me on the wet road, so I sped up and tried to put some distance between us. But when I did, the other car sped up and stayed just as close. I felt like I was being followed. Finally, at a red light, I looked in the rearview mirror of the car, a red BMW, and saw Pat Jones staring right back at me. I wondered why Pat Jones would be following me. I made a quick left turn to put my paranoia to rest, but Pat turned left too and kept on following me. I was getting close to home and I wasn't sure what to do. Alex had Mom's car, so I assumed that meant that she was home, although she hadn't been there when I left, so I wasn't sure. I didn't want to go home and have Pat follow me there without anyone else being there. Even though Pat had never done anything to me physically, he had hurt Rusty and I was afraid of him. My heart started to race and I felt a little lightheaded. I decided to drive by Cher's house. I called her twice, but she didn't answer either time. When I got there, her mom's car was gone and the house looked dark. I was afraid to stop the car because Pat might get out and chase me to the front door. I just wanted to be at home. Pat was still close behind me and I knew I would never be able to lose him. My palms began to sweat and I could almost feel my heart beating through my chest. I thought my best bet was to make it back to my house and run inside and lock the doors until Mom got home. Surely Pat wouldn't break into our house. I picked up my phone and called Mom, but she didn't answer. I left her a message to call me as soon as possible. Then I called Alex, but his phone went right to voicemail. I didn't leave a message. Instead, I threw the phone into the passenger seat and kept on driving. My hands were shaking as I gripped the steering wheel, slick with sweat. I wasn't even sure why I was so afraid. What could Pat possibly do to me that was so bad? Call me more names? Beat me up? What did I really have to be afraid of except more of what I had already been dealt? But I was. It was the uncertainty that terrified me, like how Rusty had felt in the Ferris wheel. The storm thrashed at my car. I looked at Sam's watch. 5:25. Rusty would definitely be home from school by now. Maybe he would let me come by his house. I picked up my phone from the passenger seat and called him. It rang 5 times and then went to his voicemail. "Come on, Rusty," I said out loud, watching Pat in my rearview mirror. I was almost home. If I was going to turn around and go back to Rusty's, I would have to do it now. I called him back and it rang 3 times before he finally picked up. I thought we agreed it would be best if you didn't. I cut him off. "I know, but..." And then he hung up. I quickly called him back, but it went straight to his voicemail. This time I left a message. "Rusty, please listen to this message. I'm not calling you to get back or anything. Or I'm not calling to get you back or anything. I mean, nothing more will make me happier, but I think Pat Jones is following me. I'm not really sure what he wants. Maybe he's just trying to scare me. No one is at my house, and I'm a little afraid of going back there right now by myself. If you get this message, please call me." I ended the call and threw the phone back in the passenger seat. Just as I pulled into my driveway, I ended the call and threw the phone back on the passenger seat just as I pulled into my driveway. As I did, Pat's red BMW pulled in right behind me. I parked the car and turned it off quickly. I ran up to the front door, but Pat was close behind me. I couldn't get the key in the lock quick enough, and before I knew it, Pat was standing right behind me, yelling at me. "Hey, faggot," he said, his voice thundering, even with the background of the strong wind. I stood by the front door, my hand shaking as I tried to get the key into the lock. I dropped my keys and tried to pick them up, but Pat was right on top of them. He picked them up and dangled them in front of me. "You want these?" he said, laughing. He started walking backwards around the side of the house, twirling the keys around his finger. "Come on, Danny, come and get what you want." He taunted as the rain drenched the both of us and the wind lashed our hair and our faces. "What do you want from me?" I asked, fear gripping my voice. Pat stopped. Okay, the battery died, so I had to go get another battery and change it out. Okay. Pat stopped. He was a few feet from the pool. He smiled the most disgusting smile I'd ever seen in my entire life, and then he threw the keys over his shoulder. They flew high in the sky, finally resting on the very end of the diving board. Brushing the wet hair out of my eyes, I looked at the keys, thinking I would run for them and still make it inside. "Don't even think about it," Pat said, almost snarling. "What are you going to do to me?" "I'm not sure yet," he yelled over the wind, "but I can't just let you, your bitch mom, and your boyfriend get away with what you did to me." I laughed. What we did to you? You started all of this, Pat. He shook his head. You should have just let things go. He and I fought each other and settled things. He should have just taken his punishment. For what? Protecting me? The rain was coming down so hard that we had to shout to hear each other even though we were so close. What would you do if someone was making fun of your girlfriend? He laughed. That's completely different. I started walking toward the diving board, but he cut me off. I repositioned myself and ran around the other side of the pool, being careful not to slip on the wet cement. Pat followed closely behind until I was a few feet from the diving board. I either had to make a move for it or he was going to attack me. There weren't any other options. We just stood there for a few minutes looking at each other without saying anything, the storm raging around us. For some reason, I was reminded of what Cher had said to me about my not really seeing someone when I looked at them. So I tried. I looked into Pat's eyes and I really tried to see him. Why do you hate me so much? I asked him. He looked confused, like this was the strangest question in the world. Because you're a fucking faggot, he laughed nervously. Why do you have to be such a faggot and flash your shit around in front of everyone? You don't even know why you hate me, do you? He looked even more confused, and then I saw it. Fear. Cher had been right all along. Pat was no different than anyone else in that cafeteria. He was afraid of himself. He was afraid of whatever it was he saw in the mirror that he saw in me that mirrored him. Oh my God, you're afraid of me? I almost laughed. Pat shook his head and stood up straight. What the fuck are you talking about? I'm not afraid of you. I'll beat the shit out of you. He reached for me, but I stepped back carefully, feeling the diving board against the back of my legs. Maybe you're afraid to see something about yourself in me. I'm not a fucking faggot, he spat. I didn't say you were. I slowly reached down to grab the keys. But whatever it is you hate about me scares the shit out of you because you see it in yourself. I reached for the keys, watching Pat process what I had just said. He looked scared, like I had just tapped into something he wasn't willing to recognize. I curled my fingers around the keys and stood up, just as the look on his face changed from fear to absolute anger. Maybe it's weakness or a lack of confidence, or maybe it's just plain fear. I couldn't move, so I just stood there as the words I had heard all my life ripped from his throat. You fucking faggot, I'm gonna beat your fucking queer ass, do you hear me? He went on and on, calling me every name I had ever heard since I was in the 3rd grade. None of them were new, but they didn't hurt any less. I'd given those words so much power over the years, and I was tired of giving them power. Then beat my fucking queer ass, I screamed, only inches from his face. Quit talking shit about it and do something. I was so tired of all the insults and all the threats. The look on Pat's face was one of complete surprise. He didn't know what to say. That's what I thought, I said, and turned away. But just as I did, Pat grabbed the back of my shirt and pulled me back to him. I fell a little bit into his arms, and it felt more like he was embracing me. I looked up into his face, unsure whether or not he was going to pick me up or let me fall to the ground. For a split second, there was something in his eyes I recognized, but then it was gone. Pat pulled me up and pushed me back in the direction of the diving board. Fucking faggot, he whispered under his breath. I spun around and my legs hit the diving board. I stopped and got my grounding. I wasn't sure what had just happened. We just stood there and looked at each other. He shook his head in disgust at me and let me go. I hadn't even been worth fighting, and there was something in the simplicity of that knowledge that hurt so much more than any of the names I had ever been called. I wasn't even worth it. And suddenly, like all the times before, my eyes started to flicker and I started to feel lightheaded. This time, I knew I was going to faint. As my legs began to buckle, I reached out to grab for Pat for safety, but he just stepped away, letting me fall into the darkness inside my head. Chapter 36. I woke up in the hospital with Mom and Dad asleep in chairs at the end of the bed. They were holding hands. Through the window, I could see that it was night outside, but the sky was clear and remnants of the full moon shone onto my bed. I yawned and immediately felt a weird sensation, like I was going to pass out. My mouth was dry, but it tasted like chlorine. I looked at the table to the side of my bed and saw a plastic cup of water with a straw. I reached for the cup, but found it difficult to pick up because of the IV hooked into my arm. I strategically maneuvered the cords and slowly picked up the cup, trying to aim the straw at my mouth. When I set the cup back down, I saw the band of Sam's watch hidden underneath the washcloth on the table. I reached out and grabbed the washcloth, only to find Sam's watch torn apart in pieces. It was completely destroyed. I could feel my heart begin to race as I thought back on what had happened. How had I ended up in the hospital? Just as I thought this, Dad woke up, stretching his arms over his head. He noticed me sitting up in bed and rushed over to my side. Hey buddy, how are you feeling? Mom woke up and came over and sat at the end of the bed, her hand on top of my blanketed legs. Her eyes were puffy and I could tell she had been crying. We were so worried. What happened? I asked. Dad smiled, but underneath his smile was fear. Maybe we should be asking you that question. We've only been able to put bits and pieces together so far. I tried to think about what had happened, but when I did, my head started to hurt. In fact, it really hurt. I reached up and touched my head and found a massive bandage where my hair should have been. I started to panic and looked at Mom and Dad. Dad put his hand on my shoulder. "You're going to be fine. They just had to sew you up, buddy." I wondered what Pat had done to me that would result in me being in the hospital. "I was driving home from my appointment with Neil," I said, thinking back to the appointment. But even that was a little fuzzy. And then I noticed Pat was following me. I looked at my mom. "And I called you, but you didn't answer. Then I called Rusty, but he wouldn't talk to me." Mom and Dad looked at each other as if they were a little confused. "Rusty was the first one to the house," Mom said. "We just assumed he was the one who..." And then she stopped. I looked back and forth between Mom and Dad. "What?" I said. "What aren't you telling me?" Dad took a deep breath. "None of this is making any sense," he said, shaking his head. "Rusty said you left him a message saying that Pat was following you. He said you sounded scared. He tried to call you several times, but you never answered, so he drove over to your mom's house." Dad started to cry and he grabbed my hand. "There was so much blood, Danny. You must have hit the side of the pool when you fainted. You almost drowned." He took a breath. "Rusty said your watch was hooked to the pool sweep and its hose kept pulling you down." I turned and looked at the tattered watch lying on the table. Rusty had saved my life. And just as I thought that, he appeared in the doorway. He was standing there, as real as he had always been. "Hey," "Hey," he said, sheepishly hiding behind the door. "Hey," I said. Mom and Dad turned around and told Rusty to come in and sit with us. "I don't want to bother you guys," he said, hanging by the door. "You aren't bothering us," Mom said, putting her arm around his waist as he walked over the bed. In the light, I could tell he had been crying. "You saved our son's life. That probably earns you some privileges." She looked up and smiled at him. Rusty didn't say anything, but I knew him well enough to know he was uncomfortable. Even though he had rescued me, or whatever had happened, the fact still remained that we had broken up. I smiled at him and noticed that he wouldn't stop looking at me. He just kept staring. "What happened?" I asked. Rusty shrugged. "I'm not really sure." Dad patted Rusty's back. "We really haven't had much time to talk about what happened," Dad said. "When they brought you in, they were so worried about your head injury that they started working on you right away. If Rusty hadn't gotten you out of that pool and called 911, who knows what would have happened." The room went silent. I looked up at Rusty, but he looked away. "Rusty, we owe you so much," Mom said. "I don't know what I would have done if I had lost another." She started crying again. Rusty turned and started to walk out of the room, but he stopped right before he got to the door. "I didn't save his life," he whispered. He said it so low that I could hardly hear it, but I was sure I had made out the words correctly. "What did you say?" Dad said. And then it was Rusty's turn to start crying. I said I didn't save his life. He was louder now, almost too loud for a hospital. He turned around and looked at me. Tears flooded his cheeks. "I should have," he said. "I should have been the one to have saved your life, but I wasn't. I got your message and drove straight over to your house. I was going to beat Pat Jones's ass good this time and finish this ridiculous fight once and for all. But when I got there, I heard him screaming and I ran around to the backyard. He was trying to get you out of the pool, but your watch was connected to the pool sweep and he couldn't get you untangled, so he just ripped the watch off." Rusty stopped and looked right at me, sobbing. He looked at me. He screamed at me to call 911, but I just stood there. I couldn't move. I just watched the whole thing happen in front of me. He pulled you out of the pool and set you down on the grass. He told me to give him my phone, and I did. He kept yelling at me to help him, but I just stood there, so he called 911. And then Rusty paused and looked away from me. "What?" I asked. "He told me to help him do CPR. He was yelling at me, but I couldn't move. I was so afraid. You were both soaking wet from the pool in the storm, and you were turning blue, and you looked so cold. The rain was beating on your face, and you were turning blue." He shook his head. "He started breathing into your mouth and pushing on your chest, and finally, after a few seconds, you spit out water and turned on your side. You were bleeding everywhere, and Pat took off his shirt and wrapped it around your head. He looked away like the memory is too painful. Then he stood up and told me not to leave you alone. He made me promise that I wouldn't leave you alone. And then he ran up to your house and drove away." Rusty was looking out the window now, and I felt like he was reliving it in his mind. "He just drove away," he said, looking back at me. "When the police got there, they found me standing over you. Rusty was looking out the window now, and I felt like he was reliving it in his mind. "He just drove away," he said, looking back at me. "When the police got there, they found me standing over you and just assumed I had done everything. Maybe I was still in shock." He turned to my parents. "I didn't mean for you guys to think that I saved his life. I was trying to tell you, but I just couldn't." Mom grabbed his hand. "You stayed with him. That means a lot." I shook my head and the pain increased. "That doesn't make any sense," I said. Why would Pat save my life if he was trying to hurt me?" I remembered him pulling me back by my shirt, twisting me around, falling into his arms, seeing the weary look on his face, and then he just let me fall. "It doesn't make any sense." "We're just happy you're safe," Dad said. He looked over at Mom. "Maybe we should give these two a few minutes alone." She nodded and they walked out of the room. Rusty sat down on the end of the bed. He was still crying. Why are you crying, I asked. Because it should have been me, he said. You called me and I wasn't there for you. I almost lost you. I laughed. You'd already lost me, or did you forget? I meant for good. Oh, I said sarcastically. Does that mean I still have a chance? Rusty nodded and bit his lip. I'd say you still have a very good chance. Does that mean we're not over? Not yet. Not today, he paused. Unless you want us to be over, he said nervously. I shook my head. I never wanted us to be over, I said. But why did this change everything? You might still move away. I know, he said. But something changed in me watching you out there by the pool. It's like, I don't know. I really thought I had lost you. And then when you were okay, I realized I didn't care if I got to spend 5 more days or 5 more minutes with you. I'd do anything just to have that time. Time, I said, holding up the broken watch. You know what I mean, Rusty said. I nodded. Sometimes I think I would give anything to just have Sam back for one day. But I know it would be just as hard when he was gone again. I looked down at Rusty, but I didn't die, and I'm not going anywhere. All we have is time. And then we laughed. We're starting to sound like we're in some cheesy romance drama. Well, if you hadn't noticed, I am in the hospital with my head cut open, I said. And your nose is broken and you have 2 black eyes, he pointed out. But that's not the worst part. He grabbed a hand mirror that was hanging on the end of the bed and handed it to me. I looked and found 2 blazing black eyes, a bandaged nose, and a tightly wrapped head looking back at me. It was pretty bad. What else, I asked. Rusty started to pull up part of my bandage and revealed my head, which had been sheared down to at least a ½ inch of hair. Oh no, I said, laughing. Is it all gone? Rusty nodded. Yeah, all that cool hair is gone. He walked to the chair and picked up his backpack, bringing it to the edge of the bed. But I have something that might make you deal with it better. He opened the bag and took out the pirate eye patch and hat and handed them to me. Cute. I always wanted to look like a sexy wounded pirate. You're my sexy wounded pirate, he said, and I have one more thing that might cheer you up. He reached into the bag and brought out Boo Radley. I thought you might want to see our son. Our son? Like we're both his dads, not just me? Yeah, I like the sound of it. I held Boo up for him to check out my wounded face and thought about the story Dad had told me about Sam sneaking Griffin into school in his backpack. I smiled, thinking that Sam would have liked Rusty. They were both alike in so many ways. Rusty sat in the chair next to the bed and put his head on my lap. I ran my fingers through his thick, crazy hair. I'm gonna miss my hair. Aw, it'll grow back in no time, he said. After about a ½ an hour, Mom and Dad came back. They were shocked, but not entirely pleased to find Boo huddled under the sheets, although I noticed a small smirk on Dad's face. They all insisted on staying, including Rusty, but the nurse told them I needed my rest, so she ushered them out and I was left alone. I looked at myself in the mirror. My face hurt, but there was something appealing about the black eyes and the bandages over my nose. I felt tough and I liked it, knowing I wasn't really that tough at all. It was all just like a costume. Chapter 37. The next day, Cher was the first one to visit. She was wearing a cocktail dress and heels and had on makeup and jewelry. I started laughing as soon as she walked into the room, especially because it was 7:30 on a school day. Why are you dressed like that? She sat down on the end of the bed with one long-stemmed rose in her hand. She spread out the skirt of her dress. Don't you think I look pretty, beautiful boy? I laughed. Yeah, you look pretty, but it's in the morning on a school day. She rolled her eyes. You're so silly, she said in an affected accent. I have no intention of going to school today. I have more important issues at hand. She said all of this extremely loud and aimed in the direction of the door as if she hoped someone in the hall would hear her. She stood up and walked over the door and closed it behind her, rushing back to the bed, laughing childishly. Oh my God, I have the greatest plan, she said. I'm totally going to walk around like some important bitch and totally score a doctor husband. I know I'm pregnant and everything, but I'm not showing yet, so maybe I can still snatch a good one and make him think it's his. She laughed to herself and fell into the bed, staring back at me, the rose at her nose. I hate roses, I laughed. She sat up. It's not for you anyway, you turd. I just want some fantastic doctor to think someone gave it to me and then they'll get jealous. She stood up and sat in one of the chairs, her legs wide open, no longer looking like the sophisticated lady. But really, are you okay? I was so worried about you. I nodded my head. My head still hurts a lot, but I'm going to be okay. Thank God, she said emphatically. I don't know what I would have done if I had lost my best friend. She stood up and walked to the edge of the bed. I gotta go, but I'll call you later. She reached down and kissed me, and then she danced out of the room, waving the rose like a fairy wand. Cher was gone less than a minute when there was a slight knock on the door. I looked up and expected to find Rusty or my parents, but instead saw Pat Jones, standing just inside the door. For some reason, he didn't look so frightening anymore. Could I come in, he asked. I nodded and he walked in. Pat stood over my bed and just looked me up and down, but he didn't say anything. Finally, he looked me in the eye. Are you gonna be okay? That seems to be the question of the day, I said. Yes, I'm gonna be okay. They sew me up and I'll have a scar on my head, but I'm good. Pat nodded like he was relieved. Good, I'm glad. He didn't move. He just stood there and kept on staring at me. Was there a certain reason you came by? I asked. I knew I should probably thank him for saving my life, but there was still a huge part of me that was angry and maybe even a little bit scared. After all, I was in the hospital because of him. He looked at the ceiling and then back at me. I guess I just wanted you to know what happened and to let you know I'm sorry. What did happen? I asked, realizing as much as I hated him, he held the clue to a very important moment in my life. Pat ran his fingers over the stubble on his chin. You fainted. 1 second we were fighting and I was screaming at you, and the next thing I knew, you fainted. That's not how I remember it. He raised his eyebrows. How do you remember it? I remember that you were calling me names. Then I tried to get away and you pulled me back. I felt lightheaded and I started to faint. But when I reached out to you for help, or when I reached out for you to help me, you just let me fall. That's what I remember. He closed his eyes. This isn't why I came here. I didn't come here to piss you off. Then why did you come here? For me to thank you for saving my life, I said accusingly. No, I don't know. It felt right. I laughed. Maybe you should just leave. Pat nodded and started to turn for the door, but stopped. Danny, he said, and I realized he had never called me by my real name before. I never knew how much I was hurting you, okay? Not really. But when you faded and hit your head and fell into the pool, it was all just so real. He was looking at me, but he was somewhere else. It was just the two of us out there together in that pool, and I knew it was all on me. He didn't cry. He didn't raise his voice. He was completely still. It felt like the calm before the storm. It's all right, I said. No, it's not all right. I don't ever want to be part of someone's pain like that. I would kill someone if they did that to my kid brother. And then he looked up at me. And the weird thing is, I don't even know why I do it. Really, I don't. You're just the easiest target to pick on. Why? Because you act funny, he said. You act gay. But why is that funny? He looked confused. I guess it's not. You asked me why, and I'm telling you why I did it. But it's going to stop. But what's so funny about being gay, I asked, really wanting to know. He shook his head. I don't know, I just don't like it. But why not? I don't know, he said, raising his voice, but I don't. He looked out the door like he was afraid of someone coming in. Look, I just came by because I wanted you to know I've learned my lesson, okay? I won't be mean to you anymore. I nodded. Thanks for saving my life. I didn't save your life, he said. Yes, you did, and we both know it. He sighed. I agree that maybe I saved your life. If you agree, you won't tell anyone. I thought about this for a second and then nodded. Pat reached out and shook my hand. You look pretty bad. I really am sorry. Then he turned and walked toward the door, stopping right before he walked out. For what it's worth, you were right about what you said. You were right about me. And then he walked out. Chapter 38. The last chapter before the epilogue. They released me from the hospital 4 days later. Mom and Dad said they released me from the hospital 4 days later. Mom and Dad said Rusty could take me home, and when he showed up, he surprised me by having hair as short as mine. I thought we needed to have matching cool hair, he said, smiling. He wheeled me out of the hospital and into the hot sun of early September. Summer was over, but the heat lingered on. Rusty gently helped me into the passenger seat of my car as he climbed in as my chauffeur. Destination, home sweet home, he said. Can we stop by one place first, I asked. Sure, where to? And I gave him the directions. When we got to my old house, the yard was cut fresh and a for sale sign was standing next to the mailbox. The large beech tree loomed over the driveway as Rusty pulled in. I got out and walked up to the front porch, looking around before I sat down. Rusty sat down next to me. It feels so weird that we won't be living here anymore, I said. I've moved so many times, staying in one place feels weird to me. I laughed. We're like two sides of a penny, aren't we? So similar yet so different. I looked at the driveway where my car was parked, where our Jeep should have been parked. I miss him so much, I said. I know, Rusty said, putting his hand on my knee. I looked at him. You've never said any of the crap that people always say, like he's in a better place or he's at peace. I don't know if that's true, Rusty said. Me either. But I hope it is, I replied softly. Me too. I closed my eyes and smelled the air. Kids drove by on their bikes, ringing their bells. He would have liked you. Yeah, Rusty asked. Yeah, he would have said that you were cute, I blushed. But he wouldn't have meant it that way. Sam just wasn't afraid of what people thought. Sam wasn't afraid of anything. Rusty took a deep breath. Sometimes it's good to be afraid, Danny. Sometimes fear keeps you safe. I thought about this for a moment. What are you afraid of? He didn't hesitate. You? Why me? I laughed. Why me? Because you make me feel too much. He said, I don't like feeling that much. It scares me. I looked over at him and smiled. Sometimes it's good to be afraid. He nodded. Yep. And I nodded back. Yep. And then we didn't say anything for the longest time. We just sat there on the front porch of my old house. him thinking Rusty things and me thinking Danny things, holding hands together, and just for that moment, everything was perfect. After then, I need a sip of coffee. I knew I was going to get real emotional, I just didn't know when it was going to happen. December 31st. I pinned the picture of me and Sam on the wall right under the Celia Cruz album. Next to it, I had glued the remains of Sam's tattered watch, and even though it still kept time, I didn't look at it very often anymore. Every wall in my room was covered with memories, some of them happy and some of them a little sad. Dead flowers from Holcomb Gardens, wrappers of blackjack gum, Griffin's collar, notes from Cher and Rusty, the inserts from mixtapes, the Pirate Eye patch, album covers, and my favorite bands, and Pat Jones's t-shirt, which had stopped my head from bleeding and probably saved my life. Life had gone on. Life had gone on. Rusty hadn't moved yet, and not including our brief breakup, we had been together over 187,200 minutes, but who was counting? Life had gone on and my hair had grown back, but I decided to cut it short again, liking the change from what I had always known. Instead of keeping his short, Rusty had let it grow out, and it was curlier than ever. Even though I had felt lightheaded several times, I hadn't fainted once since the accident. Mom and Dad had forced me to see a doctor, but he couldn't find anything wrong with me, saying it was probably related to anxiety over being teased. Maybe he was right, but it didn't matter. I wasn't that same terrified person anymore. Maya had gotten better, and the doctors in Indianapolis had come up with a new treatment plan that would allow her to have home nursing care to eliminate the middle of the night emergency visits. Cher was ready to give birth any second to a baby girl who she had decided to name Dusty. She had taken night school in addition to regular school and had finished high school mid-semester to stay at home once she had the baby. She never met the doctor of her dreams, and Henry didn't want any part of the baby's life, but Cher said she was okay with that, declaring that she had done pretty well for herself having just one parent. Alex and Neil moved into a loft apartment in downtown Indianapolis, and Alex taught a master's class in pop culture literature at Butler University, where Rusty and I would both be freshmen in the fall. He decided to put off writing for a while and just live, saying that writing was for people who were too afraid of life. Mom and Dad finally got divorced. I thought they might get back together, but one day they just sat down, or one day they sat me down and explained that they had decided it would be better if they were just friends. They said their marriage had been over for a long time and they just weren't willing to admit it. Dad had broken up with Jenny, and he said he had decided to stay single for a while to find himself. I laughed and suggested he schedule an appointment with Neil. Pat Jones never made fun of me again. We weren't necessarily friends, but he would smile at me when we passed each other in the halls, even though he would sometimes have that strange look of fear in his eyes. I used to wonder what it was that he was so afraid of when he saw me, but I decided that it was his deal. It was his to deal with on his own. He had given me my life, and that was enough. Rusty and I never spoke again about that day at the pool. We had made a pact that we were going to live in the present and not focus on the past or the future. Time wasn't going to have power over us anymore. We were only going to focus on the importance of the moments we shared together. When he had suggested this idea to me, I had laughed and told him I wanted something more permanent. Since the last time he had given me a reminder of my memories, it had turned into Boo's personal chew toy. In a million years, I never would have thought he would suggest we get tattoos. I thought Mom and Dad would never agree to them, but they conceded, saying I was almost 18 and I would do it then anyway. So Rusty went ahead and bought them for us as Christmas presents. I looked down at my arm and touched the inked words that were less than a week old. The before now, they read. Even though they still stung a little bit, I thought they were beautiful. Rusty walked over and lifted the sleeve of his jacket, putting his arm right next to mine. After then. I love them, he said. It's like our own personal story that no one knows. There's no beginning or end, just our own space suspended in time. I love how sometimes he could be funny and goofy, but other times he could be so damn serious and romantic. I love them too. On our way there, the snow fell around us, shining in the streetlights, giving everything a magical feeling. It would be a new year within hours, and everything seemed more exciting than usual. A year before, Sam had still been alive, but so much had changed since that time, and even though I missed him horribly, I knew I couldn't go back in time. We had reached Soda, the same band venue I had first gone to with Cher, only minutes before the band was supposed to start. We ran through the icy parking lot just in time to check our coats and find a good place to stand and watch the show. Cher and her mom were closer to the stage, and they waved when they saw us walk in. When the band stepped onto the stage, my heart started to buzz. They started slowly, and at first I didn't recognize the song, but as soon as Mom grabbed the microphone and began crooning in a whisper, I knew the song was a cover of The Cure's Boys Don't Cry. She rocked back and forth and I sang the lyrics with her like we had so many times before. It felt like somewhere in the audience Sam was singing too. Uncle Alex sat at the keyboard while Dad strummed his guitar. I watched them dancing and singing, not just playing the music, but becoming the music. And even though it was a rough cover, to me they sounded glorious. They weren't perfect, but they were mine, and that was more than enough. As Mom sang those words I knew so well, I was reminded of that ride on the first day of school, when everything had seemed so hopeless, before I met Rusty and discovered my own something to live for. I looked over at him standing next to me, rocking gently to the beat of the music, and I grabbed his hand. Cool hair, I said, smiling. He laughed, running his free hand over my buzz cut. You too. I looked up just as the song was ending. The crowd went crazy and Mom thanked everyone. I like to play a special little song with a friend of mine. She walked to the edge of the stage, where there was a small stairway, and reached her hand out to share. She took Mom's hand and walked up on stage, complete in black leggings, a black t-shirt stretched tight around her pregnant belly, and purple hair. She returned to the old chair I had first met. She raised a peace sign in the air and shielded her eyes from the light, scanning the crowd. Finally, she found me and Rusty standing in the back and pointed to us. Danny and Rusty, this one's for you. God, I don't know why I'm crying so much in this book, my lord. As they started singing, I instantly recognized Sonny and Cher's I Got You, Babe. The crowd soared. They were good, really good. The whole audience started singing with them. I floated off and started thinking about all of the things that had happened in the last year. Sam's death, my parents' divorce, Cher, Pat, and Rusty. Moments intersecting each other like some wild spider web of life. And then I realized that time kept ticking together, whether we liked it or not. Life kept happening. And sometimes things weren't measured in time. Sometimes hours, weeks, and even years went by without us even noticing. Sometimes people died, and sometimes people left. But not always. Sometimes they stayed. I looked over at Rusty. He had stayed. He had become my something to live for. I knew that there was no certainty in that either. Life was full of uncertainty. One day he might be gone, but then again, that day might never come. The magic to life was in the unknowing. What mattered most was what happened in those secret spaces between the before now and the after then, where memories lived forever, suspended in our hearts. Those were the places most sacred because they couldn't be counted in time. Rusty turned to me and smiled, and then we kissed. Happy New Year, he said. Happy New Year, I said. And I just knew that everything was going to be okay. I was going to be okay. The end. Oh my lord. Crying so much. So anyway, look at that. Woo! Let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. And that is the end of it. There are acknowledgements in there, but I can tell you right now, they'll get me so emotional that I just can't read them right now because most of it's dedicated to Pee-Pee. So anyway, and I'm already emotional enough. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. I love you guys. Thank you for listening to the complete version read by me of the before, now, and after then. I love you guys, and I will see you tomorrow. Bye.